Most people in that room saw only a black teenager, 16 years old, standing there nervous, with a small ID badge hanging from his neck. But what they couldn't see was the storm of injustice quietly gathering around him, accused of trespassing into a restricted area, labeled as a security threat by a cold and arrogant pilot, Captain Karen Whitmore. Armed security closing in, suspicious stares piercing the air, whispers slicing through the silence. But what no one there knew was that this boy wasn't as alone as he seemed, and that someone with far more authority than anyone in that room was already walking toward them. In just a matter of minutes, the truth would be exposed. And when it was, the consequences would shake that entire airport to its core. Now, let's go back to the very moment where it all began. Before we continue, have you ever witnessed a moment where prejudice spoke louder than reason? Drop your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see won't leave you the same. The air inside the pilot's lounge was crisp and sterile, like the kind of room not meant for outsiders. Seated quietly in one of the leather chairs, with his hands resting on his lap, was Marcus Hill, just 16 years old. His oversized navy blue blazer, part of his aviation mentorship program uniform, barely fit over his slim frame. A badge with the Horizon Airlines logo hung from his neck, his name printed neatly beneath it. He wasn't supposed to stand out. He wasn't trying to. He had arrived early that morning, escorted by Ms. Reynolds from Human Resources, who had told him to wait there while she stepped out for a moment. So Marcus sat, silently watching the television mounted on the far wall. It played a documentary on the evolution of commercial aviation, vintage footage of pilots in crisp uniforms, planes cutting through clouds, control towers blinking against orange skies. His eyes sparkled, soaking in every frame. For as long as he could remember, Marcus had been obsessed with flight. While other kids played video games, he devoured flight manuals. While his friends hung posters of celebrities, his walls were lined with technical diagrams of aircraft engines and cockpit layouts. Flying wasn't just a dream, it was the dream. And today, sitting in the pilot's lounge for the very first time, it felt like that dream was finally within reach. But as the minutes passed, something else quietly crept into the room. A presence. The lounge door swung open with a sharp click. Standing in the doorway was Captain Karen Whitmore, mid-40s, impeccably pressed uniform, 4 gold stripes glistening against her shoulders, her face carved from cold precision. She froze for a moment when her eyes landed on Marcus. Her stare narrowed instantly, not with curiosity, but with judgment. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she approached, every step slicing through the heavy silence. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cool, tight and heavy with authority. "Who exactly are you?" Marcus stood quickly, heart racing. "Good morning, ma'am. My name is Marcus Hill. I'm part of Horizon's youth aviation program. Ms. Reynolds brought me here to wait until my mentor—" Captain Whitmore raised a hand, cutting him off. "Wait here, in this lounge." She scanned his badge with contempt, her lip curling ever so slightly. "This area is restricted for certified flight crew. This isn't a waiting room." Marcus tried to maintain his composure, his voice soft but steady. "Yes, ma'am. Ms. Reynolds said it was okay for me to wait here. Whitmore abruptly leaned in, snatching the ID badge from his neck. The strap snapped with a sharp pop. She flipped the badge in her hand, her eyes narrowing as if inspecting evidence of a crime. "This looks suspicious." Marcus blinked, confused. "It's real. She issued it this morning. My paperwork—" But Captain Whitmore had already pulled out her radio security. "Pilot's lounge. We have an unauthorized individual in restricted airspace. Possible security breach. Respond immediately." Her words sliced through the room like ice. Marcus's throat tightened. The world around him seemed to shrink. The pilots, the airport staff, the bystanders who began gathering outside the lounge, all of them staring, judging, whispering. And in that moment, Marcus realized his dream was no longer under threat from missed exams or failed interviews. It was under threat from something much darker, something he had feared, but never thought he'd face here. The seconds felt like hours. Marcus stood frozen as the first security officer arrived, tall, broad-shouldered, his face expressionless. Behind him, a second guard followed, his hand resting near his utility belt as if ready for escalation. Captain Whitmore didn't even give them time to assess. "There," she said firmly, pointing at Marcus. "Unauthorized access, fake credentials, possible intent to compromise airline security." The guards exchanged brief glances, but said nothing. "Sir," the taller officer finally spoke, his tone neutral but heavy. "We need you to step aside." Marcus's hands trembled as he lifted them slightly, as if to show he wasn't a threat. His voice cracked, but he tried to steady it. "Please. I didn't do anything wrong. Ms. Reynolds from HR brought me here. My name's Marcus Hill. This badge is real." Captain Whitmore stepped closer, her shadow looming over him. "You claim Ms. Reynolds gave you access," she interrupted, her voice dripping with venomous calm. "But there's no record of any such authorization in the system, and even if there was," she scanned him again, head to toe, her eyes cold, "this is not a place for visitors." The hesitation before the word visitors sliced deeper than any accusation. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He knew what she really meant. He wasn't supposed to be here because of what she saw when she looked at him. His skin color, his age, his background. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "I'm begging you," Marcus pleaded, his voice thin. "Please just call my dad. He can explain everything." Captain Whitmore's lips twisted into a sharp, condescending smile. "Oh, I'm sure your father will be very helpful. Perhaps he can join us for questioning as well." She crossed her arms. "If he even works here." The words were needles. The security guards remained silent, unwilling or afraid to challenge the pilot's authority. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. The same lounge where his dream had begun this morning was now turning into a courtroom, and Captain Whitmore stood as judge, jury, and executioner. I have nothing to hide," Marcus said softly. "My father, he works for the FAA." The key room stiffened. For a flicker of a moment, even Whitmore's expression shifted, barely perceptible, but there. Then she let out a quiet, mocking chuckle. "FAA, you say?" she repeated, her tone disbelieving. "Of course. Everyone suddenly has a powerful parent when they're in trouble." The officers still said nothing. The crowd beyond the lounge glass whispered louder now, phones recording, eyes watching. Marcus's fingers tightened around his phone. He whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, the words his father had always told him growing up: "Stay calm, son. Truth stands tallest in the end." And with a shaky breath, Marcus pressed dial. The phone rang and rang and rang. And as each second dragged, Captain Whitmore stood confidently, knowing the noose she had cast around him was tightening. The storm was only beginning. The call connected. "Marcus!" His father's voice came through, calm but alert. "Son, what's happening?" And suddenly, Marcus felt the dam break inside him. His words came out rushed, his breath uneven. "Dad, I'm at the airport. They're accusing me. Captain Whitmore, she says my badge is fake. They're calling security. They won't believe me." There was silence on the other end, brief but heavy. Then David Hill's voice dropped into something colder, firmer. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not say anything else. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Marcus lowered the phone, his hands still shaking, but a flicker of strength returning. For the first time in minutes, he felt something steady beneath his feet. But Captain Whitmore only narrowed her eyes. She had heard enough. "Calling for backup now, are we?" she sneered. "Let me guess, your father's an attorney, a senator, or maybe just the janitor around here?" Several of the pilots nearby chuckled softly, their eyes gleaming with quiet cruelty. The words stung, but Marcus said nothing. The taller security guard shifted awkwardly. Even he was starting to sense that something didn't feel right. One of the younger staffers near the door, a flight attendant, bit her lip, uncomfortable, but afraid to speak up. "Look," Marcus tried once more, his voice calmer, even as his pulse screamed. "You don't have to believe me, but my father, he will clear this up." Captain Whitmore stepped even closer, her voice now low enough for only Marcus and the guards to hear. "That's where you're wrong," she whispered, "because boys like you don't belong here. You think an airline this prestigious hands out opportunities like this to people like you. You got lucky, and now that luck's run out." The guards' expressions flickered. Even they weren't sure anymore who was crossing the line. Beyond the glass wall, the whispers grew louder. More phones were raised, videos, photos, a viral storm building second by second. Captain Whitmore glanced toward the gathering crowd, her composure beginning to fray under the growing attention, but still determined to maintain control. "This is security protocol," she said loudly, turning back to the room as though speaking to an invisible jury. "Unauthorized access must be treated with full caution. This has nothing to do with his background." But everyone knew. It had everything to do with his background. Moments later, the crackle of a radio interrupted the scene. The second security officer stepped aside to answer his earpiece, listening carefully. His eyes widened, posture straightening. "Sir," he said, approaching his colleague and whispering quickly. Captain Whitmore noticed. "What is it?" she asked sharply. The guard hesitated for half a beat, then spoke, his voice audible to everyone. There's someone coming. FAA leadership has just arrived. They're requesting immediate access." The entire room fell into a hush. Even Captain Whitmore couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. "FAA, what leadership?" the security officer swallowed. "It's Administrator Hill." And in that moment, that sharp instant, everything shifted. Captain Whitmore's face drained of color, her lips parted, but no words came. The weight of her mistake crashed down all at once. The father Marcus had just called wasn't a janitor. He was one of the highest-ranking officials in American aviation, and he was walking through those doors. The heavy doors at the end of the lounge swung open. For a split second, no one moved. The tall, commanding figure of David Hill entered the room, followed by two senior FAA officials in dark suits. His presence wasn't loud, but it filled every inch of the space. The room seemed to contract under the weight of his authority. He wasn't wearing a uniform, no title badge, no entourage. He didn't need them. The moment people saw him, a silent ripple ran across the crowd. Conversations froze. The pilots nearest to Captain Whitmore instinctively stepped back, like bystanders sensing an oncoming storm. Captain Whitmore, for the first time that day, looked genuinely shaken. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she tried to regain control of her posture, her hands now nervously clasped behind her back. David Hill's gaze swept across the room like a searchlight, locking briefly onto the two security guards, then shifting to Captain Whitmore. Finally, his eyes landed on his son. He crossed the room in a few purposeful strides, stopping directly in front of Marcus. He placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "Steady. Firm." "Marcus," he said quietly, voice thick with controlled emotion. "Are you hurt?" Marcus shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir." David nodded once, satisfied. Then his entire demeanor shifted, as though a switch had been flipped. He turned to face Captain Whitmore. The entire room held its collective breath. "Captain Whitmore, I believe you're the one responsible for initiating this incident." Whitmore opened her mouth but found no words. She tried to gather herself, her voice brittle. Administrator Hill, I didn't realize. I had no idea he was your son. I was simply enforcing security protocols." David Hill cut her off, his voice still even, but now sharp enough to slice through steel. "No, you weren't. You were profiling." His words hit like a hammer. The silence grew denser, suffocating. No one dared interrupt. "You didn't question his credentials. You didn't verify the badge. You made assumptions, dangerous assumptions." He gestured toward the growing crowd. "And you did it all. Loudly, publicly." Captain Whitmore's throat worked. She swallowed, but her voice cracked. "There was a security concern. Restricted area. I acted in the interest of safety." David Hill's voice dropped lower, colder. The power in his restraint was terrifying. "Safety," he echoed. "You humiliated a minor, without evidence, in front of dozens of witnesses. And now you invoke safety?" She opened her mouth again, but this time no words would come. The weight of the room was crushing her. The security officers stood frozen. The pilots and staff watched in silent judgment. David stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying across the entire room. "Captain Whitmore, you may not have known who he was. Pause. But you decided who he was." The words cut deeper than anything she had feared. Her breath grew shallow, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Captain Whitmore took a single involuntary step back. The second FAA official spoke quietly into his earpiece, already relaying updates. David Hill didn't need to raise his voice. His authority was absolute. "In my capacity as FAA administrator," he continued, now addressing both the room and Whitmore directly, "I am opening an immediate investigation into your conduct and your fitness to serve." The words landed like a final verdict. A gasp traveled through the gathered staff. Some eyes widened, others dropped their gaze in shame. Captain Whitmore looked like the walls had collapsed around her. David turned back to Marcus, his expression softening once more. "This is over," he said gently. "You're coming with me?" Marcus finally exhaled, his breath shaking as if releasing everything he had been holding in for far too long. As they turned to leave, Captain Whitmore remained standing in silence, her face drained of every ounce of confidence she once carried. The crowd parted, allowing father and son to pass, but the weight of what had just unfolded would hang in that room for a very, very long time. The airport lounge remained frozen long after Marcus and his father disappeared through the doors. No one moved, no one spoke. Captain Whitmore stood alone, her face blank, her hands trembling slightly, realizing that everything she'd built, over 2 decades, was now collapsing, not from a loud scandal, but from the quiet exposure of her own bias. In the hallway, Marcus walked beside his father. The air felt lighter out here, but his chest was still tight, like he hadn't quite learned how to breathe again. David glanced down at him. "You okay?" he asked softly. Marcus nodded, but kept his eyes forward. "I think so," he whispered. "It's just—" His voice trailed off. "You never expect it to happen like that." David placed a steady hand on his son's back. "No one does," he said. "But when it does, you stand your ground." And you did. Marcus swallowed. Hard. His father's words felt like an anchor in a world that had tilted sideways. As they walked, heads turned everywhere they passed. Staff whispered, glancing sideways, not out of disrespect, but out of stunned recognition. Word had already spread. The administrator had just personally intervened. And the boy? He was no longer just some teenager. He was now the center of something much bigger. A few security officers down the hallway lowered their gazes as they passed. Several young airline interns, who'd heard only bits and pieces, whispered behind hands, eyes wide. They had seen enough to understand that something powerful had unfolded here, something they would remember for years. Inside the conference wing of the airport, another group of FAA senior officials gathered swiftly, already assembling files. The incident was being documented. The cameras in the pilot's lounge had captured everything, every word, every gesture. No interpretation was necessary. The investigation had already begun. Back at home later that evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. A warm cup of tea sat untouched in front of him. David entered the room, loosening his tie, and rolling his sleeves halfway up, the mask of administrator slowly fading into the simple figure of a father again. He sat across from his son, watching him for a moment in silence. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. Marcus hesitated, then finally whispered, "It's not just today, Dad." David nodded, fully understanding even before his son spoke. "It's the looks, the doubt, like you don't belong, like you're always one step away from being accused of something." His throat tightened. He blinked quickly. David leaned forward. "Listen to me," he said, voice steady. "You will always encounter people who see only what they want to see, people who measure you by what's on the surface." He paused. "But hear me well, Marcus. You define who you are, not them." Marcus lifted his eyes slowly, seeing not just a father, but the man who had stood like a shield in front of him hours earlier. "I know, Dad. I don't ever want to feel that helpless again." David's face softened. "Then don't," he said. "Next time, you walk into any room with your head higher than theirs. Not because of your last name, not because of your father's title, but because you've earned it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, Marcus's ID badge, still bent from Captain Whitmore's fingers. David placed it gently on the table between them. "This doesn't define you," he said, "but what you did today does." Marcus stared at the badge, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to exhale fully. The weight began to lift. Tomorrow, he would walk back into that program, not as a victim, but as a young man who refused to be broken, and the entire airport, the entire industry, would know his name. The sun had barely risen when the first headlines hit. FAA administrators, son racially profiled at major U.S. airport. Abuse of power unfolds at pilot lounge. Surveillance footage reveals shocking details. When prejudice meets the wrong family, David Jackson responds. The story spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, national outlets were replaying the footage on a loop. Every frame told the story. Marcus sitting calmly, explaining himself. Captain Whitmore towering above him, the moment she snatched his badge. The arrival of security, his desperate phone call. And finally, the moment David Jackson entered. Like a force of nature. Airlines, passengers, airport staff, the entire industry was watching. What had begun as a quiet humiliation in a corner lounge had now become the centerpiece of a national conversation. Inside FAA headquarters, the tension was electric. David Jackson sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by senior officials, PR strategists, attorneys, and executives from Horizon Airlines. They spoke in rushed, clipped voices, all trying to control the narrative. "Mr. Jackson, the footage is already circulating worldwide. We've never had this level of exposure. The public is furious. We have press conferences demanding statements. We're receiving calls from the Senate Transportation Committee." David sat still, calm, composed, but his silence commanded the room far more than any shouting ever could. Finally he spoke, voice deliberate and controlled. "This isn't a PR crisis," he said. "This is a culture crisis." The room fell. "Still," David continued, "every statement we make now, every step we take, will tell this industry whether we're serious about fixing it or whether we just want to make the noise go away." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "Because if we only care when it happens to my son, we've already failed. The weight of his words filled the room like heavy smoke. Several executives exchanged nervous glances, but none dared to interrupt. Meanwhile, at Horizon Airlines headquarters, the company's leadership was unraveling. Captain Whitmore's entire record had been dragged into the spotlight. Past complaints, ignored reports, repeated incidents of bias, each previously swept quietly under the rug. Now exposed, and now the world was watching. Shareholders demanded accountability. Advocacy groups rallied at terminals. Thousands of young, aspiring pilots of color shared Marcus's story online. Using the hashtag #LetUsFlyAtHome, Marcus watched it all unfold from the living room couch. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand gently. "It's everywhere, Marcus," she whispered. He said nothing at first. His eyes scanned the screen as reporters debated whether the aviation industry had ignored prejudice for too long. "It's not just about me anymore, Mom," Marcus finally said. "No," she whispered, her voice quivering. "It never was." That afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was Captain Amara Johnson. She stood in the doorway, tall, composed, her flight uniform immaculate. Marcus had seen her face countless times on magazine covers and pilot training ads. She was one of the few black women to reach her rank, a symbol of possibility for kids like him. But now she was standing here, for him. "I've been following everything," she said gently. "I couldn't stay silent." David welcomed her inside. She turned to Marcus directly. "You've been through a lot, more than most pilots experience in their entire careers. But what you did back there, standing your ground, keeping your dignity, that's what real aviators are made of." Marcus swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten unexpectedly. Captain Johnson smiled warmly. "And if you're willing, Marcus, I'd like to personally mentor you." The words hit him like a beam of light slicing through weeks of darkness. "Mentor me?" Marcus whispered. She nodded. "Yes, because your journey is only beginning. And you'll need someone who's walked that road before." Tears brimmed in Marcus's eyes, but this time not from fear, from something else. Hope. Outside, the world continued to watch. But inside this house, in this moment, a new flight path was quietly being drawn. The boy who had nearly lost his dream in a lounge corner was now preparing to soar. The next morning, the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation opened a formal hearing. It was the fastest federal inquiry into an aviation incident in recent memory. C-SPAN cameras captured every word. Millions watched live. At the center of it all sat David Jackson, calm, composed, the FAA seal shining behind him. On one side were Horizon Airlines executives. On the other sat Captain Whitmore's legal counsel. But David's presence dwarfed them all. The committee chair leaned forward. "Administrator Jackson, you sit here today, not just as the FAA's leader, but as a father. What does this incident reveal to you?" David took a breath. "This is bigger than one boy, bigger than my son. This is about how invisible barriers are built into systems, even in places designed to keep us safe." He paused, letting the words hang. "We screen for threats with metal detectors and scanners, but we forget about the silent threats, the biases we carry inside, and they're just as dangerous." The room fell silent. David's voice remained calm, but every syllable hit like a hammer. Marcus wasn't seen as a student. He was seen as a threat because of what? His skin, his age, his presence in a place some assumed wasn't for him. He shook his head. "That's not security. That's prejudice wrapped in procedure." The committee chair nodded slowly. "And your recommendation?" David leaned forward. "We don't need a new training video. We need structural reform." His voice sharpened. "Mandatory bias training at every airline. Zero tolerance for repeat offenders. FAA oversight extended beyond equipment inspections to people inspections. Because character matters as much as safety protocols." The audience behind him broke into a soft applause. Despite the hearing's rules, Back at Horizon Airlines, the walls were closing in. The airline's CEO, Bernard Talbot, tried desperately to salvage the brand's image. This was the action of one rogue captain, he told reporters. But no one was buying it. News anchors unearthed years of ignored complaints, not just about Captain Whitmore, but an entire culture that quietly tolerated such behavior. Former pilots, trainees, flight attendants, all now speaking out. One headline blared across every screen: "Aviation's diversity crisis wasn't an accident, it was a policy." Meanwhile, Marcus was invited onto every morning talk show, but he declined them all. He didn't want to become famous for surviving injustice. Instead, he focused on one thing: healing. He spent his afternoons in flight simulators again, but now under the guidance of Captain Amara Johnson. She stood beside him at every session, watching as he smoothly executed landings, adjusted trim, navigated through virtual storms. "You've got instincts I can't teach," she said one evening. Marcus smiled softly. "You taught me something more important." "What's that?" she asked. "How to fly when the whole world's trying to clip your wings." Captain Johnson's eyes glistened, but she simply squeezed his shoulder. "And you'll teach the next one too." Weeks passed, but the ripple effects kept growing. One by one, other airlines followed Horizon's lead, launching investigations, revising policies, and opening new recruitment pipelines. For the first time in aviation history, the FAA published a national equity audit, a full report exposing the blind spots that had haunted the industry for decades. And at the center of every article, every conference panel, every legislative session, was Marcus's quiet, unshakable story. He hadn't sought this role, but it had found him. One evening, David and Marcus stood together on the rooftop balcony of their home, overlooking the city skyline. The moonlight reflected in Marcus's calm eyes. David broke the silence. "You didn't just survive, son. You shifted an entire system." Marcus shook his head humbly. "I just stood still, Dad." David smiled faintly. "Exactly, and sometimes that's the loudest thing you can do." They stood there for a long time, side by side, the boy who almost lost his dream, and the father who refused to let him fall, together, looking toward the open sky where the future waited. 6 months later. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, painting streaks of gold and crimson across the quiet tarmac of Reagan National Airport. The control tower glowed softly in the distance. But the real spotlight this morning wasn't the sun. It was Marcus, standing in full uniform, navy blazer, crisp silver FAA wings pinned to his chest. He stood before the Horizon Airlines regional jet that bore his name quite literally. Painted near the cockpit door, in small, respectful letters, were the words, "The Marcus Jackson Initiative. Breaking Barriers Program." This wasn't just his first flight. It was the launch of an entire program, one designed to find, train, and lift students who had once been invisible like him. A crowd gathered quietly behind the gate windows. Reporters, FAA officials, airline executives, and most importantly, students from all backgrounds holding freshly issued ID badges. In the front row stood his father, David Jackson, no longer just the FAA administrator, but a proud father watching a boy become a man. Marcus approached the aircraft stairway with calm, steady steps, every move deliberate. He paused at the base for a moment, inhaling deeply. Captain Amara Johnson, now promoted to Director of Flight Training for Horizon, stood waiting at the top of the stairs, grinning like a proud sister. "Told you this day would come," she whispered. Marcus smiled, but his voice was steady. "I believed you." He reached the cockpit threshold. For a split second his eyes flickered, remembering the pilot lounge, the accusations, the humiliation, and the moment his father stepped in, like a towering shield. But those images no longer haunted him, they fueled him. He settled into the left seat, the captain's seat, the place that had once felt unreachable. No longer. As the final checks were performed, ground control gave the clearance. Horizon 2 in 14, cleared for takeoff. Marcus's fingers moved fluidly over the controls. His voice, clear over the radio, cleared for takeoff. Horizon 214, rolling. The engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the cabin and out across the runway. The aircraft accelerated, faster and faster. Marcus's voice lowered softly, not for the tower, but for himself. This one's for you, Dad. The plane lifted, smooth, effortless, breaking free from gravity's grip, just like Marcus had broken free from the weight of prejudice months earlier. From the observation deck, David watched, blinking back emotion he couldn't suppress anymore, his, and pressed gently against the glass. Behind him, reporters whispered phrases like historic flight and symbol of change, but David heard none of it. In his heart, there was only one sentence repeating over and over. He made it. At cruising altitude, Marcus glanced out the window. The endless sky stretched before him, wide, open, and full of possibility. He turned to Captain Johnson, seated in the co-pilot seat. "Feels different up here," Marcus said softly. She smiled. "It always does, when you've earned it." Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the moment soak into every cell of his being. The boy who once sat powerless inside a pilot's lounge, now soaring above it all, not as a victim, but as a pilot, as a symbol, as proof that sometimes the most powerful way to rise is to never stop believing that you belong.